but no one else is. Brian and Teresa, are you guys good to get started?
Yeah, I am. Teresa, you ready?
Teresa, you ready?
Yes, I am. Yep.
Okay. Well, we can go ahead and get started. So I'll just give a brief introduction to this event. So I'm Tristan Winkler. I'm the director of the French Broad River MPO. We generally get two main comments about our meetings at the MPO. One is that they go on for too long, and the other is that we don't go into enough detail. In order to help address some of that, we've decided to start having these educational events to get a bit deeper into the weeds on some of the things that we do at the MPO as well as the RPO, and how we work with NCDOT on transportation planning as well as funding decisions. So for this event, we called it Everything You Wanted to Know About Prioritization, but We're Afraid to Ask. This is definitely one of the things that gets a whole lot of comment and a whole lot of interest, both from our members and the public. In, I think it was 2018, the MPO and RPO held a joint survey, and we got more than, I think it was 5,000 responses across the region. So this is definitely a big part of what we do. This is the process that determines where the majority of transportation improvement funding goes. So it is very important, and it's something that we know our members always want to know more and more about. So today I'm really excited that we have Brian Wirt. He is the manager of the Strategic Prioritization Office of Transportation at NCDOT. Brian is one of the more busy people. So Brian, I cannot express my thanks enough for making some time for us and folks in our region to help delve into this a bit more. We also have Teresa Robinson. She is with the STIP Units Western Region. Teresa will help go through some of the funding distributions and calculations that go into the programming of projects. Just a little bit of logistics. We are recording this webinar, and we will post that to the MPO website later. The beginning of the recording might have some curses from me about our IT issues. So Hannah,
I'll edit that out.
Hannah will edit that out. We'll save that for an MPO bloopers clip at some point. But the recording will be posted for folks to reference if you have another meeting or need to go. Also, for the few folks in the house, George, we do have cookies and coffee, so feel free to help yourself. But with that, I will hand it off to our partners at NCDOT to walk us through this. So thank you, folks.
Well, Tristan, thank you very much. I do appreciate the kind words there. We are very happy to get out and speak to groups on the prioritization process, particularly at this time of year. We have project submittal windows opening soon, and that's a time that creates a lot of questions. And so this is a great opportunity for us to get out and hopefully answer some of those questions before they turn into full-fledged fires as those windows start to close. Let me go ahead and start sharing my screen here. So we do have a presentation for you here today from me and Teresa. Hold on, can I forward? There we go. The topics that we want to cover today include STIP funding. That's something that Teresa will handle. And then we'll talk about STI education, scoring overview, and scoring by mode. What I will let everybody know is that we have 40 slides of content or so, and I think 2 hours to cover that. And so we are happy to take questions during the presentation if that is helpful or necessary I don't think we need to wait until the end or for a session break necessarily to ask those questions. So if you have anything, please let us know, and we can pause and answer those questions. It's oftentimes better to do that than to wait to the end, because sometimes there's quite a bit of material in between then. So feel free to ask those questions as they come. And so with that, I will turn it over to Teresa to start with the discussion about STIP funding.
We already have a question.
Oh, okay, great. Let's go for it then.
Daniel, you should be able to talk.
No, I did not have a question. I'm sorry.
Okay, you raised your hand. I'm sorry. There was already a hand raised.
Any other starting questions? Teresa just mentioned me, and it sounds like she's having a few. Oh, she's back in. She's having a few technical issues. So as many of you may know, Daniel and I used to work together. That was not just some setup of me texting Daniel to fill time. That was fortuitous. I'm not that not that nefarious of a planner. So Teresa, are you back with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I
No.
jostled my computer docking station and then it like undocked me and everything blew up, but I am back.
Great. Well, with that, Teresa, I turn it over to you to discuss STIP funding.
Okay, great. So as everyone is aware, the STIP is a 10-year planning document that NCDOT programs all of the projects that we expect to deliver within those 10 years. It's comprised of 4 components, as you see on the screen: projects, the project schedules, estimated cost, and then the estimated budget. Next slide, please. Should take off my glasses here.
There we go.
Okay, so focusing on the projects. Next slide.
Okay.
So how a project starts the process to get into the STIP, MPOs, RPOs, and NCDOT division staff will submit these projects, and they'll be categorized in the following 3 categories: the statewide mobility, regional impact, and division needs. So statewide mobility projects are scored completely based on the data criteria that is established in the law and by the work group. The regional impact projects, the score comprises of local input points and also the total scores. And then the division needs projects also include the local input points and the scores that are calculated. So that's kind of a brief breakdown, and Brian will go into more depth about the scoring process. Next slide, please. So there are other projects with different categories that are programmed, such as alternate criteria projects. So these are projects such as your interstate maintenance projects, bridge replacements, bridge rehabs, safety projects. Those are funded through whatever STI category that they are eligible for. So your IM projects, like on I-40, if you're going to resurface a section of I-40, that would be under your statewide mobility. And these projects are funded with different flavors of federal funds. Then there are others that I know French Broad River is very familiar with: the MPO direct attributable, the DA projects, also TAP projects. There are highway rail crossings and also economic development projects. So these are also considered alternate criteria, as they have funds that are outside of the prioritization cycle, but they are put into the division needs categories. Then there are some projects that are considered exempt. So these are not given any of those three category names, the statewide, the regional, or division. So some of these examples are the Appalachian Development Highway System. So that's a specific pot of funds given to us by the federal government. Our CMAQ funds, the congestion mitigation and air quality projects. And then also there's the bonus allocation projects. And then, of course, as with everything, there's always exceptions, and there's other projects that are programmed with additional federal funds. There are some new ones, such as the carbon reduction program that is going to be implemented very soon, the NEVI funds, Protect funds. So these are just some of examples of other projects that are programmed in the STIP outside of the prioritization cycle. Next slide, please. So moving on, looking at our estimated budget. So Brian, again, will touch a little more in depth on this slide. I know it's a lot of information, a lot of colors. So again, the three main categories of projects, as you see here, are the statewide mobility, the regional impact, and the division needs projects. So after we get the budget from our Office of Revenues, we have to take out a handful of deductions for various things, such as the exempt federal funds, PE, a whole assortment of line items. What remains is then divvied up 40, 30, 30, 40% going to the statewide category, 30% going to the regional impact category, and then 30% going into the division needs. So statewide mobility is the easiest because, you know, it's based off the score, completely data driven. So you just go down the list for that. The regional impact funds are split up into 7 different buckets, and that is based off of the percent of the state population within those regions. And the division needs buckets, those are equally distributed among the 14 divisions that are in North Carolina. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we've divvied up North Carolina into 7 different regions. And so French Broad River MPO falls in Region G, which is between divisions 13 and 14, as you see here on the chart. And it's a fun region to work with, as I'm sure Tristan can tell you. Next, please. All right, looking at our estimated project costs. Next slide. So we try our best. We are constantly trying to improve this process, but we want to program the most accurate cost for the project when we program these projects in this step. As I'm sure you're aware, once a project, you know, is the brainchild of an MPO or a division staff, there's not a lot of knowns. Like if it's just, oh, we need to fix this intersection, we need to make this modification, you know, what have you. We're not going to have surveys. We're not going to have traffic data, designs. We're not going to have any of that, you know, when we have that initial thought. So we have to make assumptions. And if we don't, you know, constantly review those and revisit them, that could come back and bite us later. We've also run into issues with increased costs for right-of-way utilities and construction. In the past, we've used this GIS-based tool called the cost estimation tool, but there's a lot of limitations in that as well. And it would, you know, just spit out a number, and we would have to go and review and see if it actually made sense. But a lot of times it was not super accurate. So we have policies in place now where we are trying to review all of the projects in the various phases. When they hit certain milestones, we need to have an updated cost estimate for that phase, and the division engineer needs to sign off on that new cost, and then we'll amend the STIP accordingly. And next slide, please. All right, and then I think I have just a couple more slides looking at the estimated project schedule. So this is really just a schematic that details how we could have a really great scoring project, but if it's going to take a long time to deliver, it might not necessarily be the one that's scheduled first. So if we have a project that's further along in the process, in terms of like planning and programming, planning and design, then even if it's not as well scored, it could be moved further up into, like time-wise, into this step to be delivered first, because we want to be able to deliver as many projects as we're able to, given the funding constraints that tie us back. And I believe that that is all the slides that I have. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Again, my boss just asked me to give this little presentation to you, and these are all of his slides from when he spoke to you, I think, about 6 months ago. So hopefully I didn't say anything too different from what he did.
We've got a question in the room.
Okay.
How can one decide whether to put in for a project being, say, a mile-long segment of roadway versus intersection improvements along that segment of roadway that must be much less cost, but you had to develop multiple cost estimates for the two approaches? So does the division look at that? Do you put in them as two different projects? How would that work?
Yeah. Hey, Teresa, do you want me to take this? This feels more like a prioritization question than a STIP question.
I was, just going to defer to you, Brian.
Right. Right. So that is a fantastic question, and that's really what is at the heart of the work that is happening right now. Right now, we are getting ready to complete our work group meetings, and we'll be sending the scoring package to the board for approval on the first week of June. I forget the exact date. And then immediately after that, or not quite immediately, but soon thereafter, the project submittal window opens. And so this is a time right now where there's a lot of testing of ideas and concepts to see which work best. And so that sort of testing between a corridor projects or a series of intersection projects would occur right now. What we do allow is for projects to be bundled into one larger project. And so, for instance, in the case of 3 or 4 intersections along a corridor, those could all be bundled into one project. And so we would score that collectively. And again, this is where some of the tools that we have available, like Spot Online and our scoring spreadsheet, are really helpful, because you and your MPO staff and the corridor development engineers and the division planning engineers at DOT can work together and evaluate what the right course of action is. It could be the corridor project. It could be a bundle of intersection projects. It may just be one single intersection project now and others later. So the only way to really know is to test and then go from there. I will tell you, these are the types of calls that I am starting to get more and more of, and do anticipate responding to over the next, say, 5 months or so between now and the end of the project submittal window in September. It's a great question.
Who would we ask to find out what alternatives are being evaluated?
So I would reach out to your corridor development engineer. And I think it's Theo in Division 13, if I remember correctly.
And in Division 13, it's Stephen Sparks. In Division 14, it's currently Troy Wilson, but he just moved over to the district engineer. So I think they're planning to fill that position relatively soon.
Right.
But you can also always reach out to us or the RPO coordinator, depending on where your project is.
Yeah. Great.
I have a quick question on, rail highway grade separation projects. Those are, I think if I saw those are in division needs, and my question is, are those only eligible on state routes, or are they eligible on, say, city streets or other facilities that are crossing rail lines?
So I believe that that city street projects would be eligible for that.
Okay, thanks.
Daniel, do you want to say your question? I'll allow you to talk.
Well, since I'm allowed to talk, I'll say it. I'll actually have to look it up because I forgot what I typed. But back on the last slide, you mentioned that cost estimates are going to get updated now at regular milestones instead of on the just when they go into the step and then, you know, huge amount of times thereafter.
Yep.
But I recall there being this old rule about if a project's cost changed by a significant amount, I think the number was 20%, that you'd have to resubmit it to prioritization. And I just wonder, with more regular checks, if that's going to play out the same way, or have y'all reconsidered that policy?
Brian, are you familiar with that?
Yeah. So
okay.
what happens, not terribly frequently, because it really pertains to committed projects. So projects that are in the first 5 years of the STIP and have construction dates attached to them. If those projects experience a cost increase, we do review the prioritization results from the round in which it occurred and check to see how the score would change. If the score remains above the lowest scoring project to get programmed, then the project stays in. If not, then we, provide that information back to the project team and ask them to kind of scope those things back down or look at other options.
If the project cost is greater than 2 million and a 25% increase than what the previous cost was, then that will have to go through a STIP amendment process where the Board of Transportation will have to approve it. FHWA will have to approve it. If it falls within the MPO's boundaries, they'll have to approve it. So that's kind of like on the STIP side of things. Yeah, I'm sorry, this is kind of like, there's a little bit of overlap, a lot of overlap between like STIP and SPOT, but also we are different.
All right, and I actually have a second question while I'm still permitted to talk.
I won't take away your permission, Daniel, I promise.
For now, Daniel.
Earlier you mentioned the different funding sources like CMAQ, and you said there was a plethora of kind of some other unique funding sources. I think just for everybody's, or at least for my curiosity, two that are, I think, of a big concern. And I think, Brian, I asked you about this at the conference, that, we're really exploring in our region is wildlife crossings and resiliency projects, both on the I-40 corridor and like down in Transylvania County. And some of those, I think, are somewhat new through IIJA. And I'm wondering, like, how long, like, are we going to miss the kind of the first cycle of those funds, just trying to get implementation and procedures in place to program those funds? Or are those more or less first come, first serve until there's enough demand to utilize them?
Yeah.
Sorry, Brian, did you want to say something?
Go ahead, Teresa.
Okay. I know the resiliency funds under the PROTECT program, we do have a pilot project that we're currently working with the division. I think it's in 14. It has to deal with a section of I-40 where it's notorious for a bunch of landslides, and they're reworking the drainage system underneath the road, and that's the section of the project that qualifies for the PROTECT funds. So I'm not sure exactly how like the floodgates will open so that other projects will be allowed to like utilize these funds, because I think we're still in like the infancy of that program. Does that answer your question? Or Brian, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would add that the work group has looked at resiliency for at least the last 2 cycles. And while we haven't made any movement to add it into the process yet, we did review a number of items this cycle that are underway currently that do look promising as ways to bring it into the prioritization cycle in the future. And so it is at the forefront of the work group's mind. Now, to your ultimate question about will we miss the first round, that I'm not sure. I don't know the specifics of those programs well enough to know. Usually the project has to be in the STIP, but just because it does not include a wildlife crossing, or just because the process doesn't look at wildlife crossings or resiliency doesn't mean there aren't projects that could compete. So I don't think that we would necessarily miss out. We might not have the universe of projects we want, but that is speculative to say. There's no evidence to say that we do or we don't on any side of that. So yeah, I don't think it would hurt. Well, I don't think it would prohibit us from going after those types of grant funding.
And the department is certainly interested in using all funds that are available to us. So we'll definitely work with you in the jurisdiction to like make sure we can utilize these funds if they apply. So it's definitely on the forefront of our minds.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah, we've got another question in the room.
Yep, go for it.
Just a question on the data that's used when the projects are submitted. In particular, here in Buncombe County, it's my understanding that the NCDOT puts adjustment factors on traffic counts, which creates the AADT number. There was just an article in the local paper where an AADT number was quoted on a roadway that's currently heavily over capacity, but the AADT showed it way under capacity to the tune of about 25% lower than the actual NCDOT spot volumes that were taken for traffic counts. So, I mean, is it, and I don't know how often the AADT is updated. How do you get the most accurate information to be used when you're evaluating projects?
Yeah, that is always a, I don't know if struggle is the right word, but that is something that's at the forefront of the spot office's mind, and something that we work with the work group to come up with a process to handle. The AADT data is updated every 2 years. And so everything that has a count will get updated. There are expansion factors that go in there. I don't know all the details on those, but it is not, let me be careful with my words here. I don't want to unfairly malign things. Part of the process of developing the current ADT is to look at previous AADTs. And so that AADT data set is sometimes lagging in picking up large changes like that. But
you're being very tactful, I understand.
Yeah, well, and what I would say is too,
myself, so.
It's also kind of outside of my area of expertise. We do have fantastic folks in transportation planning who I would encourage you to reach out if you want to know more. Carrie Morrow is the manager of the traffic survey group who is in charge of that information. Stephen Piotrowski is really intelligent on that. And then Kent Taylor is our, I think, state traffic count engineer, I think is his title. Kent Taylor is on a number of national committees for data collection in AADT. He is an absolute wealth of knowledge. And so I would encourage you to reach out to those 3 folks to get the on those.
I've got Terry Morrow's name. The last name that you said was on the national committee. Can you spell or repeat it?
Yeah, it's Kent Taylor, K-E-N-T. Taylor is T-A-Y-L-O-R.
And these guys are in Raleigh, right?
That is correct.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we do have another part of the presentation that Brian will go into more specifics about the spot process.
Yep.
So if there are any other questions regarding to this STIP, I'm available for questions, and I'll hang on to as Brian has given his part of the presentation.
Yeah. Any other questions now before I jump into the STIP education or the STI education component? Okay. So
right.
I like to start when we discuss STI with a brief history of the prioritization process here in North Carolina. Where it all started was in 2007, 2008. NCDOT engaged McKinsey Consulting to conduct an evaluation of the process of project selection within North Carolina. And out of that report, the spot office was created. From there, in 2009, the governor signed Executive Order number 2 related to the need to implement a prioritization process within North Carolina. I always like to make a point to call out that this was Order number 2. That is usually Order number 1 has some highly ceremonial reasons. This is a high priority for the governor when they came in 2009 to move forward with this. And with that, the first prioritization cycle occurred in 2009. That is what we refer to as P1.0. P2.0 occurred in 2011. And then in 2013, the legislature and the governor came together to enact and pass the Strategic Transportation Investments Law. And this is the law that governs the prioritization process. And so at this time in 2013, almost 10 years ago today, that's when it went from recommendations and executive orders into legislative requirements. P3 was completed in 2013. It produced the 2016-2025 STIP, and it was the first STIP adopted under the STI legislation. Since then, we've had prioritization cycles roughly every 2 years, with P6 initiated in 2019. Unfortunately, as many of you know, P6 was ultimately canceled due to some macroeconomic concerns. We have restarted the process, and P7 will be kicking off here in just a little while. The STI law does what I would think is a good job of identifying certain aspects of the system that must be in place, and then relegating or delegating to a work group a number of other items about continuing the process and keeping it in place. And so the STI law defines the funding categories, which Teresa mentioned earlier, and we'll talk about in a little bit more depth here later. Project eligibility, so which projects can compete in those funding categories. The highway scoring criteria names, as well as certain funding constraints. But then it's left up to the work group to come up with a number of aspects of the process. This involves the scoring process, the highway measures and weights, the non-highway criteria measures and weights, the funding allocation between mode, which we refer to as either modal allocation or normalization, as well as the process for receiving local input on the priorities identified through the process, which is currently done in the form of local input points. So you can see that the work group has a lot of say in how the process is carried out. Now, one of those items that is defined in legislation are the categories as well as the eligibility here. I'm not going to belabor this slide too long. I am happy to send these slides along so that you can have them at your disposal and as a reference for later. A couple of key takeaways here. Only highway, aviation, and rail projects are eligible to compete at that statewide mobility category. Another takeaway is that bicycle and pedestrian projects are only eligible to compete at the division needs category. There was a lot of, I think, thought that went into identifying these items and really trying to keep similar project types together. So with that, I have a few graphics to help illustrate which items are eligible at the various categories. Starting first with highway at the statewide mobility category. What you can see here is that the entirety of our interstate backbone is included, as well as many of our US routes and certain routes on the STRANET or on the NHS system at the time. A key takeaway here that I always like to leave everybody with is that the statewide mobility eligible routes make up only 5% of the centerline miles of the state. Now, they make up a much larger proportion of the traffic and the volume on the state, but the statewide eligibility route is limited to just those projects or just those facilities, and they are approximately 5% of all centerline miles. The next group of eligible facilities are regional impact projects. This is all NC and US routes that are not captured at the statewide mobility category. And this represents approximately 15% of all centerline miles. And then lastly are the division needs category. This is the remainder of the facilities in the state. You can see how that coverage looks. If there's not orange on that area, it's either too swampy, a military base, or a mountain. So lots of coverage. I'm sure you can probably pick up which areas don't have orange in your area and kind of know exactly what those are. But the key takeaway here, this is 80% of all centerline miles. So the overwhelming bulk of facilities are in the division needs categories. That's not necessarily where all of our needs for improvement are, but that is how that shakes out as far as highway eligibility is concerned. Within the aviation realm, we have those same three categories. Our 5 largest commercial service airports in Asheville, Charlotte, the Piedmont Triad, RDU, and Wilmington are statewide mobility eligible airports. Our next, our regional impact, are the 5 remaining commercial service airports. These are the airports in Concord, Fayetteville, Coastal Carolina, Pitt Greenville, and Albert J. Ellis, which I think is Jacksonville. I can never quite get those correct. And then the remainder of our GA strips across the state are at the division needs category. We also have our rail network. What we have here is our Tier 1 rail network. So these are the rail facilities that are eligible to compete at the statewide mobility category. They all total comprise just over 2,500 miles. Approximately 322 miles are owned by the North Carolina Railroad Company. That is a public company. And then the remainder is split relatively evenly between CSX and Norfolk Southern. And then lastly, I want to take a moment here and talk about some funding caps and restrictions that impact programming as well as project submittal. So first is the statewide corridor cap. What the corridor cap does is limit the amount of funds that can be spent on any one facility within a division or an adjacent division. This really impacts the statewide mobility tier. And what this does is this makes sure that not all of the statewide mobility money gets spent on one corridor in one part of the state. And so this is some of the times the reasons why we separate out projects. But this is also a reflection that even though we have needs and we are trying to address the highest needs, we are trying to address needs across the state. So this ensures that that statewide mobility pot of funds that represent 40% of the funds allocated through the prioritization process continue to be distributed across the state. We have funding limits on light rail and commuter rail projects. These require that all other fundings be secured before prioritization funds are allocated. We have funding limits on regional impact transit projects. Regional impact transit projects must connect more than one county, a minimum of 2 counties, but the total amount eligible for those funds are limited. Within airports, there are funding limits on all airport projects. Most of the funds associated with airport projects allocated through the prioritization process are sort of last mile funds. So for instance, if one of those statewide mobility projects or airports had a project that costs, let's say, $8 million, the legislation limits the prioritization process from allocating more than $500,000 per project per year. So if it was an $8 million project that would take 2 years to construct, we would be able to program $1 million of funds for that project, which means the other $7 million of funds would need to come from the airport or some other source to get that project funded. And then the last item, there is a prohibition on using state funds to match federal aid for independent bicycle and pedestrian projects. And what this means is that for most federal aid, there is an 80-20 match, which means that 80% of funds can come from that federal source, but it must be matched by 20% of funds from a local source. The legislation as it's written currently does not allow for the use of state funds to be the match for those federal aid projects, which means that the match for standalone bicycle and pedestrian projects must come from other sources like municipalities frequently. So any questions on eligibility or funding cap restrictions? I think now is a good time to pause a little bit and see if there are any questions out there. I'm not hearing or seeing.
Daniel, you should be able to unmute.
Well, I wanted to wait. Just a couple questions on the funding sources, and now that I've had to speak, I forgot them. Do any of these limits affect direct attributable funds and like independent grants and how those get worked in?
I don't think they would impact DA funds or grants. They could conceivably with the bike and pedestrian projects if you're trying to seek a state match for a grant, but that is an atypical occurrence. So for the most part, no, they're not going to impact those funding items.
I'm sorry, that was really meant to be a softball. I think the MPO has really focused on using their DA funds to get around some of these prohibitions, especially for the local bike ped projects.
Right.
Just
yeah, I think what we tell people is if you have a bike ped project you're trying to get funded is first try to not use federal funds if you can. And if you have the local funds or anything non-federal, that's usually the easiest. The next easiest is probably utilizing the MPO's DA funds. And the third is rolling the dice in the prioritization process. As a region, we've had some success pulling down bike ped projects through this process, but not a lot. I mean, the MPO has 26 submittals. I can't remember offhand how many the RPO does, but I think when we did a breakdown after P5, we're right about 2% of the funding we've pulled down through this process has gone towards bike ped projects.
Yeah, the DA route is the route that many of our larger MPA recommend to utilize for those bike and ped standalone projects. Yes. And so I will just mention that is part of the legislation. And so as is the great part about living in a democracy like the United States, if that is something that you would love to see changed, certainly contact your local state House member or local state senator and lobby them for that. I know there has been discussion of removing that prohibition in previous legislative cycles. And so, you know, feel free to reach out and try and make that case. Any other questions? And I will say, I don't know that I can generally see the hand raising, but I can see the Q&A pretty well, if anybody wants to use that. Okay. Not hearing any, we'll move on. Talk a little bit about the work group and how they operate. So the legislation does require that NCDOT continually improve the methodology and criteria used to score all projects, and we are directed to continue the use of a work group process to develop improvements to the prioritization process. Right now, for P7, the work group consists of 26 members. There are 4 representatives from the MPO community, 4 representatives from the RPO community. There are 5 groups that are also members of the work group. They are the Metro Mayors Coalition, Regional Councils of Government, the North Carolina Rural Center, the League of Municipalities, and the Association of County Commissioners. All of those, other than the Rural Center, are specifically named in the legislation as participants. The work group did decide, I think in P6 4 years ago, to include the Rural Center as they had a voice that was felt to be needed at the table. The remainder of the work group is made up of NCDOT staff. This includes 4 division engineers, an NCDOT multimodal expert. Right now, that is Julie White, who fills that role, and then 8 subject matter experts, including members from the modal division, the spot office, as well as our partners in project delivery. In addition to that, we have advisory and subject matter experts who also attend. They are there to help provide information to the work group, and this includes additional modal staff, legislative staff, members from FHWA, and other technical and support staff as necessary. You can see down here at the bottom that for this cycle, we have been meeting in person monthly from October through May for the purposes of discussion and consensus. And then we have been having virtual meetings in between those for information and technical breakouts, as well as our subcommittees. And so the work group does quite a bit of work over a very short period of time. Tristan is part of the work group. He is a very important voice within that community, and we are happy to have him. If you are looking to inform the process, speaking to the work group members is a great way to do that. The way it is set up is that the work group members are supposed to be representing areas and communities and pulling in feedback from people that they interact with and bringing it to the work group at large, and then disseminating out. And so if you have ideas, thoughts, concepts that you would like for everyone to be aware of, working with your work group members is a fantastic way to do that and to get that process going. And so now, want to take a little bit of time here and go more in depth on the funding distribution within the STI legislation. What is important to note here is that everything you see on this slide is defined in the STI legislation. So these are not things that the department or the work group have the ability to recommend changes to. This is something that is codified in law, and it is required that we follow. And so the first bucket there is the statewide mobility bucket, and this is 40% of all funds allocated through the prioritization process. And this is an important aspect of the STI legislation. For any of you that have been around for a while, you may have been familiar with the previous funding legislation governing North Carolina, which was the equity formula. The equity formula had a focus on building out the network throughout the state. And to do that, it split the money equally between the 14 divisions for the most part. What this led to, though, was a situation where some of the statewide needs, particularly statewide needs that were at the border between two divisions, weren't getting addressed very well. The poster child for this that a lot of people point to is the Yadkin River Bridge on I-85. If anybody had the pleasure of driving over that 10, 15 years ago before that got redone, you know how difficult that was. I-85 was generally a 65-mile-an-hour corridor from High Point down to Charlotte, with the exception of the Yadkin River Bridge, which still had only 2 lanes and I think a 50 or 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. And so to address that issue, this legislation includes this statewide mobility fund, where those statewide needs have a place to compete for funds without stealing money necessarily from other local needs and priorities. I think this is a very important aspect of the legislation, particularly coming out of that equity formula realm. From there, we have the regional impact, which comprises 30% of the funds. And again, this then is divided between those 7 buckets based on population. You saw the slide earlier from Teresa, which detailed which regions had what percentage of the funding and what percentage of the population. Important things to note here, though, is that things like bridge replacement, bridge rehabilitation, and highway safety are programmed first. And what that means is that those projects come off the top of these individual buckets, and then what it remains is what is eligible for projects that go through the prioritization process. And then lastly, we have the division needs category, which is 30% of the funds split evenly between our 14 divisions. And again, the takeaway here is that there are a number of funds that are programmed first before the prioritization project. So again, we have the bridge replacement and rehabilitation funds for bridges on division needs facilities. We also have safety. We also pick up here the direct attributable, the transportation alternatives, the highway rail crossing, and the economic development funds. So if you were to have an economic development project in your area, that would come off of your division needs funds before any of your other prioritization projects were programmed. And what that means is that these programs, I don't know if reduce those buckets is necessarily the right term, but they do have an impact on how much money is available for projects going through the prioritization process. And so here we just have another slide that tries to help get at those funding items and a little bit more clarity. We do have 2 types of funds that don't go through prioritization. The first are alternate criteria. And what this means is that they utilize a prioritization process, but they utilize an alternate set of criteria to determine their priorities. They are still data-driven. They are still quantitative in nature, but the process utilized to distribute these funds, like the direct attributable funds, like the highway rail crossing, like the safety funds, do not use the work group process and the prioritization process. They use their own unique process. And then our second pot of funds are exempt funds. And these are funds that are outside of the STIP. And these are in many ways federal programs that have specific requirements associated with them. So you can see here it includes the ADHS, Appalachian Development Highway System, the carbon reduction, the CMAQ programs. These are all specific federal funds and federal programs that have a specific need that they are trying to address. And again, the final takeaway here is that this is defined within the STI legislation. So this is not something that NCDOT, the secretary, the governor, or the work group gets to make a change to. Any changes to this would require legislative updates. All right. So what I'm getting ready to show you here is our overall process slide. This takes a lot of the information that we've shared with you so far today, and it tries to break it down in how the process works and how we ultimately deliver a prioritized list of projects and ultimately the STIP that comes from those. So the first step in our process is that projects are submitted by our MPOs, our RPOs, and our divisions. These are the three groups who have the capability to submit projects based on the legislation. And so as the question earlier about should I do a corridor project or should I do a series of intersections? Those are the types of questions that are asked during this phase before ultimately approval is granted from governing boards to submit projects. Once those projects are submitted, they come to the spot office for review. We're going to be focusing on three main items. The first is reviewed for category eligibility. So again, making sure that it's going into the right bucket. It's either statewide mobility, regional impact, or division needs. We're then going to screen the data and QA/QC it to make sure it's accurate. If you heard Teresa earlier discuss some of the cost estimates, this is when those cost estimates will be reviewed. It's also when the data associated with scoring will be reviewed to make sure that it's accurate. During this phase, after the spot office reviews things, we do send it back out to our RPO, MPO, and division partners so that they can get a review as well. We try to have as many eyes as possible look at the data to make sure it is as accurate as possible, because that is very important to step 3, which is the calculation of those quantitative scores. And so what I always say here is that these 3 steps are the busiest 6 months of the cycle as far as the spot office is concerned. There is a lot of work that goes into these 3 steps. There are a lot of partners that are involved in these 3 steps. The submittal and the scoring is really the heart of the process. So once we have all the quantitative scores calculated, we then program the statewide mobility funds. Statewide mobility projects are 100% quantitative, which means they are based solely on the prioritization score. There is no local input for statewide mobility projects. These projects are programmed, and then projects that are not programmed but were eligible at the statewide mobility level cascade down, and they'll cascade down to the regional impact category. And what that means is statewide mobility projects that didn't get fund compete in this regional impact bucket with regional impact projects. So those projects are all together. A draft set of scores will be released, and this is the first local input point window that opens up. This is when our RPOs, MPOs, and the divisions have a chance to show their support for a project by putting some of their local input points on that project. And what you can see here is the regional impact score is 70% quantitative and 30% local input. And so that local input is really helpful in differentiating those top tier projects, those top scoring projects, into which projects are going to be programmed and which are not. And so once we get those local inputs in, we will program those projects, we will send that out, and then all projects that were eligible now cascade down to the division needs. Again, this is when a second local input point window opens up. As you can see here at the division needs category, the process requires that we use 50% quantitative and 50% local input. The local input on division needs projects is a huge component of it. You can see that makes up half of the score. This is where I would say the MPOs, the RPOs, and the divisions have the most say in the process. This is where a project that is a high priority in your area, but maybe does not score as well within the prioritization system, can get that show of support that is needed to get it into the STIP, to get it programmed.
Right.
Is there a question? Because I was going to pause here because this is a great time to take questions.
Hi, this is Scott Adams with the FBRMPO. On the regional impacts and division needs percentages, you're noting that those are 70% and 50% quantitative. So the question I had is, are local input points, is that both quantitative and qualitative?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Every MPO, RPO, and division has to have an approved methodology for how they will allocate their local input points. And within there, they identify both quantitative and qualitative aspects that they will utilize to assign their local input points. I offhand, I don't recall, Tristan, what the French Broad River process is. But every area has a unique process for allocating those points.
I'm very disappointed you don't have our local input point methodology memorized. But no, we have a number of measures, far more than one, quantitative and qualitative. But we do have a question from Maggie Ullman. Maggie, you should be unmuted.
Hey y'all, this is Maggie Ullman. I'm from the city of Asheville. I'm on city council here. This information is so helpful, by the way, new to the MPO, and this is just the type of onboarding that I was hoping for. So thank you. I know putting this together isn't briefed for y'all to prepare. And similar to the gentleman who spoke before me, really, this is helpful to zoom in, you know, as a member of our MPO board, this regional impact step and this division needs step seem like really constructive and influential places for us to be, right? And so you also mentioned that this is a 2-year cycle that we go through this, and maybe I caught that wrong, but I guess what I'm asking is, since this is very cyclical, what season do those things happen? Is this like a spring season? I'm just trying to understand kind of the workflow, because to get anything into these, it's not just one municipality's priority, right? It's us as a team at the MPO. Right. So just, I'm trying to understand the rhythm of those conversations so I can be asking, there you go, perfect. Just
Maggie, the check's in the mail. I appreciate the transition.
You got it, boss.
Yeah, the process and the schedule are highly interconnected here. And thank you for the opportunity to transition to this slide. However, if there are other questions, as you saw earlier, I can go back if need be. I really wish there were a way to show these two slides together, but they both need a lot of space to fully convey the information that they have. So what you see here is the P7 cycle. And so you can see that the work group kicked off in October and is running through May. And then we will, again, be going to the Board of Transportation in June to seek approval on the process. In July, Spot Online will go live, and that will kick off the project submittal window. That will run from July until September of this year. We anticipate Spot Online being back up no later than July 10th. And then the project submittal window will close September 29th, which is a Friday. From that point in time, from October through March, there will be the data review and scoring. We generally identify February as the month for our partner review. However, what we have been asked by the work group and what we are going to try and employ this time is to have a more continuous review throughout the process, so that we can get that feedback earlier and kind of chunk that review up to deliver all of your projects in 1 month to review all of the data of them. That's a lot for any one group to handle. And so we think that by separating that out, one, we'll get that second set of eyes earlier, which should help us to identify the projects where there are issues. And two, hopefully it'll make that list a little bit easier to digest, and we won't have to try and eat the elephant all in one bite. In April of 2024, we'll program those statewide mobility projects, and at the end of April, the quantitative scores will be released, as well as the statewide mobility funded projects. And what's important to note here is that projects get a quantitative score for every category that they're eligible to compete at. So a statewide project would get a statewide mobility score, a regional impact score, and a division needs score. And so you would have all of that information as you move into that first local input point assignment window, which is right now scheduled from May to July of 2024. I will tell you, we talked a lot about this. We know that a lot of our partners don't meet in June or July. We understand the constraint that this puts on our RPO and MPO partners. Unfortunately, we really don't have a lot of wiggle room in this window. So if you're going to take a vacation in 2024 in the summer, think about early August or maybe early June, because you'll probably have to have 2 meetings during that 3-month time frame. One to put your potential scores out to public review, and then another one to adopt it. So that local input point window will close in July, and in August we will program the regional impact projects. And by we, the programming is really where Teresa and the STIP unit kicks in. That is where the prioritization office takes a step back. We let them go forward and do that. Once those are programmed at the end of August, the regional impact total scores and the funded projects will be released. That way you'll know the totality of projects that are eligible to compete at the division needs. And that division needs local input point window will open from September through November of 2024. And then in December and January, we will be programming the division needs projects with the goal of releasing a 2026 to 2035 draft STIP in February of 2025, with the hope that there is final STIP approval through the board and FHWA by August of 2025. So that is the general time frame. What's not shown here, and what you may be picking up on, is, wait a second, this looks like more than 2 years. And that is correct. There is generally 2 years from this point, the project submittal back through the STIP. The next work group, the P8 work group, will kick off in October or so of 2024. And so there is always this overlap at the end of odd years where the STIP, the draft STIP, is being developed and the work group is being engaged on developing the process for the development of the next STIP.
Thank you, Brian. We also have a question from Matt Manley.
Yeah, can you guys hear me okay?
Sure can.
Yep.
Just a general question, how best can city staff, in my case, or county staff, work to further our local projects through the prioritization process?
Yeah. So
I guess specifically with the 7.0.
Yeah, Matt, that's a great question. There are 2 areas where our partners at the local municipality level have a lot of input. The first is on the project submittal. So choosing the right projects to submit is very important. And that's also a time where, again, I would work very closely with your MPO or RPO staff, work very closely with your NCDOT partners, and try to refine your projects as much as possible to still meet your needs, but do so in a cost-effective manner. Whatever you can do to drive down the cost will have an impact on the scoring. Now, you don't want to submit something that doesn't meet your needs. That's not fruitful. But your project submittal is where you have quite a bit of opportunity. And it's important to remember in project submittal, you're not just choosing which projects compete, you're also choosing which ones don't compete. And so if you want to focus on a few, that's something to consider there. You may have as much power in keeping projects out as you do in submitting good projects to begin with. And then the second opportunities are the local input point windows. And particularly within the division needs category, strong local support between the MPO, RPO, and division is really what's necessary to push division needs projects over the finish line and into the STIP. And so that's an area where there's a lot of ability to have your voices heard and to push projects forward.
Yeah, and Matt, just a little more specifically for someone in your shoes. So the MPO staff works with the Henderson TAC, both on selecting submittals as well as the potential assignment of local input points. And so that's the group that we work with in Henderson County. In Buncombe, Madison, and Haywood, we've typically worked directly with staff. But I think, again, in your shoes, it makes sense to really coordinate very closely with your TAC and board rep, Jen Hensley.
Maggie has another question, and then John in the room will do a question.
Okay, great.
Everybody. So in this one, I'm not sure, this might be more for Tristan, but this is just so I can help like lock this in. So in this current example of the P7, Tristan, we just went through a process the last couple months looking at projects. That's also when we split the Sweeten Creek project, right? That is us doing our internal prioritization as a team in order to put it into the queue of the spot process this summer. And then since this is a 2-year cycle, it'll be another couple years before we would put new projects in for the P8. So for example, if we want to put the southern part of Sweeten Creek back in, that timing would be more like early 2025.
For Sweeten Creek, that is something that we're planning on having as a submittal for P7.0. So, I mean, just a little bit, to go back a little bit, the process that we've been going through and selecting what projects stay on the STIP or fall off the STIP or get split or something else, that's really going to developing the 2024 through 2033 STIP. So that whole process is, the results are reflected in that document. P7.0 is expected to, the results of that will produce the 2026 through 2035 STIP. So P7.0 is going to be our next opportunity for either getting new projects funded or getting some of the projects that fell off of the STIP back on.
Okay, so what, and thanks for getting granular since I'm brand new to this. So what I've been participating the last couple months is the tail end of the P6.0 partner input.
For the most part, yeah, I mean, P6.0 was anticipated to produce the 2024 through 2033 STIP, but when it turned out that there wasn't money and there was too much on the books, instead of doing a round of prioritization or P6.0, instead we went into a process of removing projects and figuring out what projects stay on.
Okay, so so we as a community here are just starting the chance to look at P7.0 projects, and we would hope to put the Southern Sweeten Creek in that.
Right, exactly. And I mean, just to get a little more into the weeds, there was a decision kind of made by the prioritization work group and the Board of Transportation a couple of years ago when the scope of the cost increases really became clear. I think I've shown a chart a few times that basically if we kept things how they were, we wouldn't have any new regional impact funding until something crazy. I think it was like 2052 or something like that. And so the kind of question that was posed was, you know, do we leave things how they are and just not have funding for new projects for a long, long time? or do we right-size the STIP so that we can have at least some funding available for P 7.0? And the latter was the decision by both the work group and the Board of Transportation.
Thanks again. I know that was like a highly granular example. It just really helps me lock in the learning. So really, thank you.
No, that's a good question. We also have a question from Kim Roney.
Wait, John, I'm going to talk after.
Oh, sorry, John.
You should be able to talk now, Kim.
Thank you. So can you go back over the timeline for when we might expect a potential update or next step in that P 7.0?
Yeah, so the next step, for us specifically in the spot office is the June Board of Transportation meeting, where we expect to get adoption on the methodology. The next step for this group is the project submittal window from July to September of this year.
John.
Yeah, I'm like Maggie, I'm new to this right now, and I'm looking at this and I'm saying, is there any way to get a local project into the flow early on where we know we're not going to get state funding from the first bucket, we know we're not going to get regional funding from the second bucket? Can we, instead of cascading down and being left with the scraps, is there a way that we can jump up to the front of the line and start the planning process earlier, because we know we're not going to get state funds or regional funds?
I mean, the submittal window that Brian's talked about that's planned for July through September, we put in all the projects. So we go through and we select, I think we're allotted 26 highway projects, 26 bike ped projects, 26 transit projects. So we select all of them and submit them. And then the process of local input points and what tier it falls into is really based on the project type and what facility it's on.
This is Daniel. I may have misunderstood the last question. I thought you were asking specifically about projects that aren't getting state funds, or just projects that would end up in the division tier.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that it sounds like the division projects, they have to fight at the state level, then the regional level, and then they fall down to the local level, the division needs. And I was wondering if we knew that we weren't going to be necessarily eligible for the state funding, and we know that we weren't going to get regional funding, was there just a way to just say, hey, we don't want to hang around until 2024 to find out whether or not we're going to get this funded? Can we jump to the top of the line? Can we, in effect, cascade up and just say, we'd like to have a placeholder here so that we know further out than almost 2 years from now whether or not we're going to get any money? And Tristan is sitting here shaking his head going, no, that's not how this works. So it's cascading up is one of the things that is not allowed as part of this process. We've asked, Brian, please tell me if I'm wrong. But yeah, it really is, we select the projects. They can be division needs eligible, they can be eligible for statewide or regional, but we submit all of them as do divisions and RPOs. And then they get scored and the funding decisions are made based on the schedule.
Yep.
Yeah, I'll also add, there is already an existing TIP with existing projects. And, it's helpful to think about this as kind of a backfill. When these projects get added to the TIP, they'll probably won't be funded for 2024 or 2025. These projects are likely to be funded in the out years.
Right.
Because the most current projects will be the ones that were prioritized in several rounds past, barring the giant rework we just did. And the other thing that I think Brian has pointed at, but hasn't maybe fully set in, is when projects cascade, there is a new scoring system at the new level, and it doesn't help your timeliness. But when you get to the division tier, the scoring system does tend to favor local projects over, say, an interstate project that's moving in. It's not always true, but there are changes to what data is being used and how they're being weighted.
Yeah, and those are the slides that we have coming up here in just a little bit. So I'm happy to get into that in more detail in just a bit if we want. Any more questions here before we move on? We'll go
I
ahead.
don't see any hand raised.
Do we have a hand raised?
No.
Okay. All right. So the next section is kind of brief. It's a scoring overview, and it's a quick overview of how the process works. We've discussed a number of these aspects already, but there are a few points that we do want to make sure that we go through. The first, the criteria names on highway are defined in the legislation. We do not have the ability to change this. Criteria names are only defined for the highway mode. They are not defined for any of the other mode. We have to use a 0 to 100 point scale. So we have to convert our raw data and measures to a 0 to 100 point scale. Again, that's part of the legislation. The work group does have flexibility in utilizing and determining the methodology used to calculate the criteria. So that is where some of the flexibility comes in. Some key definitions that I want to go over. First, criteria. These are the names of scoring components that are identified in law. And these definitions really pertain to the highway mode. For the non-highway, it was up to the work group to determine those criteria. A measure is a data-driven way to evaluate a criteria. A specific criteria may have one or multiple measures. Some criteria that we utilize have only one measure, while some have multiple. We will get into some of that in the next section. Scaling is the way that we convert a raw measure to a 0 to 100 point scale. We scale everything at the measure level because we use measures to build criteria and criteria to build the final quantitative score. And by assuring that the building blocks are on that 0 to 100 point scale, it ensures that the entire score is on the 0 to 100 point scale, as is required by the legislation. Measure weight. This is the percent of a criteria scored accounted for by a single measure. Different measures for the same criteria may have different weights. So we may have a situation where a criteria has two components and each make up 50%. We can't have a situation where a criteria has two components and they total to 100 but are not each 50%. The criteria score is the sum of multiplying each scaled measure by the measure weight. So again, we get that scaled score, which converts a measure from whatever scale it's on to a 0 to 100 point scale. We multiply that by the weight for that particular measure. We add up all of those products, and that is our criteria score. The criteria weight is similar to the measure weight, and that is the percent of total quantitative score accounted for by a single criteria. So whereas the measure weight is the percent of the criteria score accounted for by a measure, the criteria weight is the percent of the total quantitative score accounted for by a single criteria. And then lastly is the quantitative score, which is the sum of multiplying each criteria score by the criteria weight. So how does that look? Well, we start by collecting data. For this particular process, we're looking at the congestion criteria. And for the congestion criteria, we need two pieces of information. We need the volume information and the capacity information. But we're going to use that volume information in two different places. So we're going to analyze that information, and then we're going to come up with our measures. Within our congestion criteria, we have a volume to capacity measure, which is a measure of congestion, as well as a volume measure. And what we're trying to do within that criteria is identify not just the bottlenecks, but the bottlenecks that impact the most vehicles. And that's what the volume measure is utilized for. We then scale those measures to get those onto a 0 to 100 point scale. We apply the measure weights, and ultimately we come up with that criteria score. In this case, it is the congestion criteria score. To build the highway quantitative score, we take all of those criteria scores, we weight them, and then we finally get our highway quantitative score. This is an example of how it would look at the statewide mobility level. Any questions here? I know that that's a lot and a lot of definitions, so I'm happy to pause if there are questions at this point in time.
There are no hands raised.
Okay, awesome. I'll move on. The components of a total score. The total score is the combination of the quantitative score and the local inputs. And so you can see here, as we mentioned earlier, the statewide mobility category is all quantitative. The regional impact is made up of 70% quantitative and 30% local input points. And then our division needs is a 50-50 split between those local input points and our quantitative score. So you may be curious as to how does this work? There are two groups that can provide local input to a project. The first is the MPO or RPO in which the project resides, and then the second is the division in which the project resides. And we weight each of those equally. So at the regional impact, where 30% of the score is based on local input, half comes from the division's input and half comes from the RPO and MPO's input. The same occurs at the division needs, but ultimately measuring 50% of the scores. As we mentioned earlier, and as I failed to memorize before I got here, every group must have a methodology. Asheville has one that is unfortunately not at the top of my memory. The process must adhere to the methodology and process standards that we have set up. One thing that we make sure that we look for is a deviation clause within the methodology, which allows the TAC and TCC to deviate from their previously described methodology, so long as they document and provide the rationale why when that goes out to public involvement. We do require that there's at least two criteria, with at least one being a qualitative criteria. There is a public involvement requirement during the local input point process. Deviations must be clearly articulated. And then we do have a flex policy. And Tristan, I'm not sure how much this would apply to Asheville, but what we have found and what we have heard from our partners is that some areas have more projects at either the regional impact or the division needs category, and they'd like to use more of their points there. So we allow them to flex points from one bucket to the other, so they can put those on more projects at one of those two categories. So this is another good stopping point. That's the overall scoring overview of how the process works. Our next section and our last section, we're going to talk about the criteria weights by mode, so we can get into more detailed information there, as I was alluding to earlier. But I will take a moment and pause here. I see we have about 30 minutes left, which should be more than enough time to cover our last section. So we do have time for questions, if there are any here.
There are no hands raised. Does anyone in the room have questions?
I'll just make a quick comment on, in terms of the flex policy, I think that's something that could be handy at some point in the future. But to note, the MPO's current policy is that we have a little bit of fiscal constraint. So in the past, we've had sometimes in the neighborhood of $1 to $2 billion in projects that we're considering putting points on. when there's only 100 or $200 million available. So as part of our policy, we've kind of adopted this stance that we will put points on projects either until we're out of points or until we're at, I believe, 150% of the funding we anticipate to be available. Just to hopefully give a little more weight to the local input points that are being provided. So that's something that we've done in the past. And yeah, I mean, we have, since we've adopted that, we have not exhausted our points, I think, at either tier. I think in the last round or two, we've done that.
Excellent. Fantastic. Yeah, and that is, as we mentioned earlier, it's a really important thing to remember. You're not just picking which projects get points, you're also choosing which projects do not get points. So there are two sides to that coin as you're making that decision. And I do think it's important to try and keep those in mind. That can help you maximize the chances of getting not just projects, but the projects that you want.
Right.
Right. So right now we're going to move into the scoring by mode. What we are going to focus on today are the criteria weights. We do have a slide deck that we are happy to share at a later time that goes into more detail of the individual criteria. I'm also happy to take any questions about those today if you have them. But what we're going to focus on today is that high-level criteria weights. The criteria conversation is probably an hour to an hour and a half if you want to have that. And if that's something that you would like for us to come and present to you at a later date, we're more than happy to do that. Not to plug ourselves for the next one of these, but you know, we're happy to come.
Yeah, be careful what you're offering, Brian.
I know. If I got paid by the presentation, I might be a richer man, but as I mentioned earlier, I think this is one of the most important things that the spot office can do is to come out and to provide information and an opportunity to ask questions, because it can be on its surface a fairly straightforward process. But as with anything, the devil is in the details. And so I'm happy to take that time. I much prefer answering these questions now as opposed to in September when there's a lot of time constraint. So I think that is very helpful. So where we will start with, and this kind of gets at what Cooper was mentioning in the question earlier about maybe cascading up that you can see. One thing that I do want to alert everyone to, within highway, we have two general scoring systems, one for mobility projects. So these are widening, intersection and interchange improvements, access management, or projects that add capacity. We have a second set of projects, modernization projects, which we will talk about on the next slide, which are about updating the roadway network to our current standards or updating future interstates to interstate standards. So what you can see here are the criteria weights based on the various criteria. One item I do want to call everyone's attention to is down at the bottom, related to the economic competitiveness and the accessibility and connectivity criteria. You will note that economic competitiveness only has a criteria weight at the statewide mobility, whereas access and connectivity only has criteria weights at the regional impact and the division needs. That is explicitly mentioned in the legislation. While there are 10 criteria, these two were specifically called out, with the economic competitiveness only being used at the statewide mobility, and then accessibility and connectivity only at the regional impact and the division needs. So if you're curious as to why those two are like that, that is because that is required within the legislation, that if we are to use those, we are only to use those at those areas. So the first criteria that I want to mention is the congestion criteria. And as we mentioned on those slides earlier, that is made up of a volume component and a volume to capacity component. And you can see at the statewide mobility, it makes up 30% of your score. And so we're really focusing on trying to identify those areas that are over capacity and identifying those. What you can see is that percentage drops as we move down from statewide mobility to regional impact and division needs. But what's important to remember is the regional impact totals are out of 70% and the division needs are out of 50%. Our goal isn't to try and multiply a total score by 0.7, it's to have that score right off the bat. So our criteria weights sum up to the total percent of the quantitative score. Our next criteria is benefit cost. Right now, we calculate the benefits as the travel time savings benefits and the safety benefits over 10 years divided by the cost to NCDOT. So if you remember earlier where I was suggesting that you look at ways to right-size your projects to the needs, that's because it impacts this benefit cost criteria. You want to try and maximize those safety benefits and travel time savings benefits and minimize the cost. What you can see here is that benefit cost is 25% of statewide, 20% of regional impact, and 15% of division needs. Safety is our next criteria. One question that I frequently get when we talk about this slide is why is safety only 10%? And that is an excellent question if anybody is thinking about it. And what I will tell you is, while safety is our top priority at the department, we have many other pots of money that can address safety issues. And we have specific pots of money to more immediately address safety issues. The thinking is that we are trying to improve safety through the prioritization process, but the full goal is not to do that directly. So that is why safety is only 10%. We have other programs that can address those high safety needs immediately. And that's also a reflection of the process. As you heard Daniel mention earlier, projects that compete in prioritization take a number of years to get to construction. If it's a true safety need, we don't want to wait 10 years. We want to use those funds that have a short fuse and get out there and do something right away. Our next criteria is freight. We look at both the total truck volume and the percent of trucks on a facility. You can see that freight makes up 25% of the statewide mobility, but then drops to 10% at the regional impact and 5% of the division needs. And again, that's a reflection of what a priority it is to keep freight moving on that statewide mobility tier, but then a recognition that once we move down to the regional impact and particularly the division needs, we're not looking at freight as the sole focus area. Those are the mobility criteria weights, so you can see how a mobility score is built. Our next slide is on modernization. And so I'm not going to go into detail of all the weights here. What I do want to draw your attention to is that congestion, safety, and freight are part of both modernization as well as the mobility criteria. However, the modernization scoring is also looking at things like lane width, comparing the current lane width to the design standard, paved shoulder width, as well as pavement condition. So what we're trying to do is identify those facilities that are not up to current standards and trying to identify those, but then utilizing factors such as safety and freight to differentiate the projects beyond just their geometric standards or how their current geometry is compared to the ideal standard. You will note that congestion is a small component of modernization and dwindles down to 0 at the division needs. At the division needs, you can also see that safety is a major component of those non-geometric items. So I will take a moment here. I think now is a good place to pause before we move into the non-highway criteria weights. Does anyone have a question about either the modernization or the mobility criteria weights that we utilize within the prioritization process? All right. I'm not hearing or seeing any. Again, I'm happy to share the presentation, but this is a good way to start thinking about your projects as you're starting to evaluate them for submittal to P7. Do they score well in these categories? And the ones that score well in the categories are the ones that you may want to submit now. And the ones that don't are maybe ones that you want to hold on to for a later date. If you have projects that maybe don't score well in these, you need to think and have an idea of if you'll be able to use local input points on those at the division needs category, which is an opportunity to really have a lot of say in which projects get programmed. So we'll move on to aviation scoring. There are a number of ratings within the aviation scoring system. The first is a project rating from the Department of Aviation, and this is, I think this is about need. ASIP is from the FAA Airport Capital Improvement Plan. This is a place where FAA has a ability to speak and also identifies the need for a project. What's important about the FAA ASIP rating is there's a need for a strong score within that rating as well to get FAA funding. So this is a recognition that many of these aviation projects need not just state support, but they also need FAA support as well. We have a constructability index, which is the sum of metrics rating a project's constructability. Obviously wanting to focus on projects which are easier to construct and deliver. And then lastly, a benefit cost, which is the total economic contribution divided by the cost to NCDOT. And what I would say is, as we mentioned earlier, most of the aviation funding obtained through prioritization is last mile. And so airport projects do tend to do well within the system. However, they are capped, as we mentioned earlier, depending on the category they compete in. We have our bike and pedestrian scoring. Again, these are only eligible at the division needs, so we only have a set of division needs criteria weights. You can see that safety makes up 20%, accessibility and connectivity is 15%. This is, a measure of what the facility will connect people to. We have a demand density, which is the number of households, employees per square mile near the facilities. We're trying to prioritize projects near higher demand density to maximize the return on investment on these projects. And then lastly, a cost effectiveness, which are the remaining criteria divided by the cost to NCDOT. I will note that we have a ferry scoring system, but I'm not going to spend time on this in Division 13 and with Asheville, as this is not pertinent to your region. I see a chat. Is there a question? Oh, 15-minute warning. Yes. Thanks, Teresa. Just a few more slides at this point in time. Within public transportation, we have 3 groups of projects. The first is a mobility project. And so these are fixed guideway vehicles or route-specific vehicles. And so this is kind of like your standard bus project as a good way to think about this. And so you can see we're looking at impact, which is the number of trips affected by a project, the demand density, which is the total trips divided by the service population, and efficiency, which is trips divided by total revenue seat hours. What we made sure to do within the within the public transportation scoring is to utilize these ratios. And what that does is that allows transit providers of different sizes to compete on an equal playing field. Obviously, if we were using total trips in either location here standalone, then it's very likely that our transit providers in Raleigh and Charlotte would likely do very well compared to others. By dividing it by the service population and the revenue seat hours, that tends to normalize that impact of size. And then lastly, we have a cost effectiveness measure, which is additional trips divided by the cost to NCDOT divided by the lifespan of the project. This is the only mode where we bring in that lifespan component. our next set of projects are demand response projects. What this typically is, this is kind of dial-a-ride if you're familiar with that term. This is also where microtransit would compete if you wanted to look at a microtransit service. And so again, much the same as the mobility, but the efficiency is slightly changed to be a vehicle utilization ratio. And what we're trying to do there is make sure that the vehicles that are funded out of this are utilized at a high degree. We don't want the vehicles sitting empty if at all possible. And then again, the same cost effectiveness metric. And then our last component of public transportation scoring is facilities. These are for buildings, passenger stations, mobility hubs. Again, the impact, number of trips, a demand density, and an efficiency score, and that same cost effectiveness metric. One thing that the work group has looked at and wasn't able to come to consensus on in P7, but I think we will look at in the future, is some sort of state of good repair of the existing facility. Unfortunately, what this set of criteria don't take into account is the current state of the facility. Sometimes it's the current state of the facility that is driving the need to improve it. And we wanted to find a way to bring that in. So that is something that the work group continues to look at. And then our last item is rail scoring. Again, there's a benefit cost score, a system opportunity score, a safety score, a capacity and diversion score, and then finally an economic competitiveness score. And what's important to note here is that rail uses the same economic competitiveness framework that the highway projects do, which is a software package called Tretis. And so there is some commonality between the rail scoring and the highway scoring, which we see is helpful. And so that is the end of my slideshow. We are at 2:50 right now, so I'm happy to take questions for the next 10 or 15 minutes, if there are any. If there's any specific mode that somebody wants to look at in more depth, please let me know and we can do that as well.
Scott has a question in the room.
Yes, hi. On transit, I noticed on that, I think it was a slide regarding, I guess, sort of, standard bus transit. Does NCDOT have a current policy on bus pullouts? Most everything that I've seen, at least as of recent research and experience as a transit user, is that's generally not preferred from a transit headway and reliability standpoint. But I guess I'm just openly asking if NCDOT has any particular stance on those.
I'm not aware of a specific policy offhand. Our partners in the Integrated Mobility Division, headed by Ryan Brumfield, is a great person to reach out on that. It's my understanding that IMD shares the same view, and that's always what I have adhered to in my long-range planning, is that bus pullouts, while well-intentioned, just means that buses can't get back into traffic. And so,
exactly.
Yeah. But I do think some of that is left up to local areas to weigh in on and case-by-case review. So I'm not sure that there's a specific policy. It wouldn't shock me if there's guidance. But again, I would reach out to Integrated Mobility on that specific question.
Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah. Great question. Any other questions today?
Daniel.
Hey, since it's become a topic in the region, I just want to check, but new passenger rail transit services would score under transit and not rail, correct?
New passenger rail. Passenger rail is eligible at the division needs category in rail. It would be dependent on the type of system that it is. So for instance, like the S line, which is designed, I don't know if it's designed yet, which is visioned to connect Raleigh more directly with DC. those would compete as rail projects. Now, if it was intra-city rail, those would probably compete as public transportation projects.
Right. The committee is probably aware that, I'm thinking of the new Salisbury to Asheville study that's out there.
Right. I would anticipate that competing as a rail project and not as a public transportation project.
Right, and just to point out, we have submitted that as a rail project in the past, and with all the new federal funds that are available for passenger rail, one of the things that we would still need would be state match. And as of right now, the place where we need to get that state match from is through this process. Vicki, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Tristan, for recognizing me. Brian, this is not so much a question as a comment, kind of for the benefit of the folks on the meeting here. When looking at, I'm not sure you mentioned this, and if you did, I apologize, but when looking at public transit and bike ped projects, we do have the ability to bundle some projects together. So for instance, if you have a number of intersections that need improvement for bike ped, those could be submitted as one project. If you had a number of transit buses, or you wanted buses and shelters, you could bundle that sort of thing together too. So just to get folks thinking about project potential types.
Yeah, that is an excellent point, Vicki. Bundling transit projects makes a lot of sense. There is a minimum cost, and I forget what it is offhand. And so if you've got a couple of projects that are below that threshold, bundling them together to get over, or also bundling them together so they take up one slot as opposed to multiple is a great thought.
Exactly. And also that may be something we need to revisit, Brian, is the minimum cost, because I believe the minimum cost was reduced down to 40-some thousand for transit, because that used to be the cost of the vehicle.
Yeah.
That has gone up significantly. So we might have to.
Any other questions for us today?
Going once. Okay. Well, Brian and Teresa, I really want to thank you guys for your time on all of this. This is not something that they necessarily have to do. They volunteered for it, and so thank you, thank you. We hope everyone finds this helpful. Again, we will put the recording up on the MPO website with the removal of my cursing at the beginning. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out. We will be bringing this up as a topic at our TCC and board meetings, most likely almost every month for the next 2 years. So you will be hearing plenty more about it, but in the meantime, any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Hey, Tristan, would you like me to send you a copy of the slide deck?
That would be fantastic.
I will do that here in just a moment.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. I hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks, John.